Throughout 1947 to 1991, there was a silent fight that was threatening the safety of the world. Two global superpowers were at odds because of their difference in ideologies. This conflict was further fueled by their growing technological advances in weaponry and the expansion of land between the two powers. They were both tense, worrying that the other would try to spread their influence and land throughout the world. This is the Cold War, a battle of information and intervention between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. After World War II had ended, the two alliances that were fighting for a common goal for defeating the Nazis had split, as they no longer had a common enemy to fight. They both had a distaste for the other's ideology, and their goals now were to spread their own ideology and prevent the others from doing the same. From the Soviet view, they were worried about the US dominating over Europe. The Soviet ambassador, Nikolai Novikov, had said how the US's broad plans for expansion have been developed and are being implemented through diplomacy and the establishment of a system of naval and air bases stretching far beyond the boundaries of the US, using its foreign policy, saying that this reflects the imperialistic tendencies of American monopolistic capital and is characterized in the post-war period by a striving for world supremacy. In response to the worry of US outreach, the USSR had spread its influence to Eastern and Central Europe to create a buffer zone between NATO and itself. From the liberalist view, they saw this expansion as a threat, appearing like the activities of Hitler and a violation to their ability to have capital and land in other countries. The British Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill, had stated how he believed that the many countries in the buffer zone are in the Soviet sphere and are all subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. Both tense about the other's expansion, they were on edge of having another battle. But the alliances of NATO and the Warsaw Pact couldn't start fighting each other because of how powerful both of them were. The US, being part of NATO, and the USSR, being part of the Warsaw Pact, both had nuclear weaponry, and if those weapons were used, both sides would be destroyed, and other countries around the world would be affected by the nuclear fallout. So instead, they both tried giving funding, weapons, and training to their allies to fight for them in these countries called hotspots. These two powers wanted to spread their influence to gain a step over the other by trying to take control of the many countries weakened by World War II. One of these countries is Vietnam, and during the Cold War, a massive conflict had started between its north and south region. According to Britannica's article, Vietnam War, before the Vietnam War, Vietnam was under French control, and the nationalist groups of Vietnam, looking up to the Soviet Union's and China's communism as an example, decided to fight back against the French, taking back Vietnam. This was the French Indochina War, and as a result of the war, Vietnam was split in half by the Geneva Accords, where the Vietnamese Communist military forces went to the northern part of the country, where they developed the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, while the French military forces went south, where the state of Vietnam was established. After the withdrawal of forces, Vietnam decided to have elections to figure out their future. These elections had drawn the attention of US President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The history professor who wrote Vietnam War, Ronald H. Spector, writes how Eisenhower was accepting the de facto partition of Vietnam as unavoidable, but still pledging to halt the spread of communism in Asia. The elections were interfered with by the Vietnamese Communist Party to further influence communism around Vietnam, and by the US to continue fighting against the spread of communism in Vietnam. Eventually, in 1955, the result was that the South became an independent Republic of Vietnam, and the non-communist Ngo Dinh Diem became president there. As a leader, he was horrible, as he made a system for extorting and paying off people. Ronald H. Spector writes how in this system, in the countryside, ambitious programs of social and economic reform had been allowed to languish, while many local officials and police engaged in extortion, bribery, and the theft of government property. The growing number of Vietnamese people who were alienated by this corruption, along with the rest of many Vietnamese communists, had sparked acts of terrorism and assassinations from both toward the southern government. This was the start of a war between the North and South, where the Soviet Union and China poured weapons, supplies, and advisors into the North, which was trying to take over the South, where US administration made great efforts to reassure Diem of its support, as Spector writes. US involvement in Vietnam's South sought out to establish their liberalist ideologies in Southeast Asia and to stop the North's spread of communism, as shown by Eisenhower's interest during Vietnam's elections. This is also fueled by the idea that if one of the Southeast Asian countries gets taken over by communists, the other Southeast Asian countries would fall under communism too. As stated by Ronald H. Spector, US President John F. Kennedy accepted without serious question the so-called domino theory, which held that the fates of all Southeast Asian countries were closely linked, and that a communist success in one must necessarily lead to the fatal weakening of the others. The Soviets' involvement with northern Vietnam dealt with a similar goal, where they wanted to spread their communist influence, so they funded communist liberation efforts against non-communists. Many fights were fought in the war, but eventually it had to come to an end. Efforts to establish a ceasefire were ongoing, and on January 27, 1973, the agreement of ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was signed by representatives of the South Vietnamese Communist Forces, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the US. Though, this wasn't the end of the tragedies of war, as Spector writes how hundreds of Vietnamese continued to lose their lives each day after the fighting was supposed to have stopped. As the US slowly withdrew its involvement and support in southern Vietnam, the corrupt government was left with a lot of problems. The leaders in northern Vietnam saw the opportunity, and on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, as reported in Asia Pacific Curriculum's article, Vietnam After the War. The southern Vietnamese government then surrendered and handed control over to the communist forces, and the country was officially united as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Vietnamese infrastructure was greatly damaged, and land scarred as a result from the weapons used during the war, and the people devastated, as many as 2 million civilians died in the conflict, along with 1.3 million Vietnamese soldiers, reported by the Asia Pacific Curriculum Resources Project. When the North got control over Vietnam, as the southern government surrendered their power, they tried to reform its political and economical situation. To solve the political worries of people going against the government, people who went against the North during the war, or disloyal to the government, were, as the curriculum writes, subjugated to torture and brainwashing and forced to do hard labor in inhospitable areas of the country. Some, who were taken away to camps, were never seen again. A system was also placed down where people were categorized as good or bad based on biographies made describing their life. The people loyal to the North were rewarded with opportunities as they were categorized as good people. Now, economically, they wanted to disassociate with any capitalistic behavior. So, the government took private property and took control of businesses. The government also wanted to develop a system of collective farming to feed its people, so it organized half of its rural population to farm in collectives. The Curriculum Resources Project explains how these collectives put several families together into a single unit that was expected to combine what they produced and turn over any surplus, anything above what they needed for their basic and immediate consumption, to the government. Their collected surplus was supposed to go towards feeding everyone else in the country. Though this system didn't give any incentives for the farmers, so instead, they farmed only for themselves. The Curriculum Resources Project writes how Vietnam, once a major rice producer, was experiencing cases of famine or near famine. The boat people of Vietnam are the Vietnamese refugees who tried to escape Vietnam during the government's economical and political reconstruction after the fall of the South Vietnamese government. As written by the historian Maud Emmanuel Lambert in the article Canadian Response to the Boat People Refugee Crisis, the tense political situation, rapidly deteriorating living conditions, and human rights violations in these countries triggered a vast wave of immigration. The refugees trying to escape the reforms set out onto the Southeast Asian seas and hope to find a better life in other countries across the Southeast Asian region. Though these attempts to leave Vietnam were risky because, as mentioned by Lambert, they were going to travel abroad on seaworthy makeshift vessels with risks such as drowning, hunger, dehydration, attacks by pirates, sexual assaults, and even murder being included with traveling.
Another problem they had was trying to settle down on foreign land, as refuge camps began to fill up, and some countries don't even have an obligation to grant asylum. Though the situation quickly changed, as the United Nations in 1979 had a convention that resulted in 3 agreements to help the refugees. According to the Curriculum Resources Project, those agreements were that Vietnam agreed to the Orderly Departure Program, which involved taking measures to make these departures safe, orderly, and legal. That Australia, Canada, France, and the United States led a group of more than 20 countries in speeding up the process to 25,000 refugees permanently resettled per month. And the 5 Southeast Asian countries that had been the site of the first asylum for many of the boat people, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, agreed to provide temporary asylum. While this didn't totally solve all the problems the boat people had during their travels, it did prevent a lot of lives from being lost, and it did grant a lot of Vietnamese lives a chance to survive and thrive in another place.